The government obviously has set a net zero target for 2050, which is legally binding, and that's as a result of the Paris Climate Agreement, which basically, I think most people know, we need to halve emissions if we are to reduce global warming to at least 1.5% to kind of mitigate the worst effects of climate change. For a business, that means calculating your baseline carbon emissions, reducing them as far as possible, and then offsetting the rest. There's a bit of a kind of greenwashing approach sometimes to offsetting, so it's kind of the absolute minimum that you just logistically or financially cannot get rid of is where you should be looking to offset, and not just kind of blanket offsetting everything, which people are doing. And obviously there is a place for offsetting, but it's not really going to be as fast a reduction in carbon as we need. So the drivers, why might you as a business be looking for net zero? So obviously contributing to the global efforts to cut emissions in half, cut emissions by 2050. If you have a company policy to reduce your carbon emissions, maybe you've sort of made a commitment, but you haven't actually started yet. So this is kind of what this is going to be about. Legislation, so the SECR means Streamlined Energy Carbon Reporting. It's more for medium to large businesses, so mostly SMEs aren't looking at that, but depending on the size of your business. Managing and mitigating your value chain, sort of looking at kind of future risks along your value chain for people who maybe aren't looking at this point, and how to get them started or move away from them. Compliance with procurement. So I'm actually working with a few people now who have come across PPN 06. It's a government procurement policy. If you want to get on a framework for any project with the government that is 5 million or above, you need to have your PPN 06 sorted, which is basically a carbon reduction plan. And it looks at kind of following your steps for scope 1 and 2. And then there are 5, which I'll mention, of the scope 3 emissions that you need to address. Meeting client or stakeholder expectations and kind of holding up your reputation accountability. And they're obviously reducing expenses for your kind of energy and gas bills. So scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. These are kind of defined by the greenhouse gas protocol, which is something that kind of you would go to initially to get kind of your guidance or your calculators. They've done absolutely incredible work in kind of defining how to approach assessing and reducing your emissions. Scope 1 are your direct emissions, so basically any energy that you use kind of on site. For most companies, this is going to be kind of your gas boilers. Most people don't have energy generators on site and things like that, but if you do, that would be your scope 1. Also, if you have company vehicles that you own, rather than kind of company vehicles for partners who you pay the expenses for, it's slightly different. That is in scope 3. Or things like refrigerants. So obviously refrigerants may leak greenhouse gas emissions, so you need to take account of that as well in your scope 1. Scope 2 are indirect emissions, so basically purchased energy, heat or steam, so kind of your electricity bills really. And then scope 3, which is everything else, so your value chain emissions. And so if you're like me, I am a one-person consultancy who works in a co-working space, basically don't have any scope 1 and 2 emissions, so everything's scope 3. But for most companies, 80% roughly of your emissions may be in scope 3, depending on the size of your business. And this is a delightful image from the greenhouse gas protocol, kind of visualizing that. You've got upstream scope 3, downstream scope 3, and kind of, I'll discuss these in more detail later, but that's... You have to initially define your organisational boundaries. So do you own or rent your premises? How many businesses do you operate? If your premises, your assets, whether you have financial or operational control, all these things will define how you approach assessing your emissions and kind of then eventually reducing them. Your reporting period, so setting a base year. Obviously, most companies will be reporting over the last either financial or calendar year, but you may also want to set a base year in the past from which you have good data and also from which your kind of business currently is still in a pretty similar place. If you've changed a lot, if you've moved, then it may not be suitable to have a base year from different premises or totally different organisational boundaries. So it's up to you to kind of define that and also to record that as part of your reporting process. And then obviously looking at your business activities and environmental impacts of that, and also looking at your kind of procurement. So scope 1 and 2 emissions. So as we've discussed, those are the kind of the indirect and direct energy. So a bit more straightforward, actually collecting the information that you need to work out your baseline carbon footprint from this. So mostly it's going to be utility bills or meter readings, so kind of gas and electric. Expenses for company vehicles. They found that hilarious. Yeah. For air conditioning units, depending on the size of it, obviously it may be that you don't really need to incorporate that as part of your reporting, but if you do have kind of air conditioning units, mostly that information is going to come from your maintenance records. And then there are, again, as part of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and actually the UK has its own emission factors. You would convert your energy usage or kilowatt usage into a equivalent carbon amount, and that's your baseline for your carbon from scope 1 and 2. The carbon factors that are available obviously are UK based. They're kind of based on the location of the grids and averages, but if you can get more specific information from your provider, that's preferable, obviously, as well, because a lot of people are using green tariffs now, so that will affect the kind of carbon intensity of your emissions. Another picture. Here are, in more detail, the 15 scope 3 categories that you then have to look at. So if you're doing the PPN 06, upstream transportation and distribution, downstream transportation and distribution, waste generated in operations, and business travel and employee commuting, which are obviously a bit more straightforward to gather. And they've done that to make it, again, easier for any kind of company who's going for that framework to actually report on, because as we'll sort of vaguely discuss, purchase goods and services and other things like that, it's a lot of work, and I think it would take you longer to get on the framework. So they've made allowances for that, basically. So how then, if there are so many scope 3 emissions, do you prioritise them? It's basically, again, a process of establishing a greenhouse gas inventory for your company. You kind of look at the size or quantity of goods and services. Maybe you only want to look at proportionally as a sort of top 50% of your spend or quantity of goods or services that you get into your company. And that's totally fine. Obviously, you're kind of setting a baseline. You're setting your targets. So the idea is that as you get better at this, you incorporate more and more greenhouse gas emissions or get better data as you go along. So defining the kind of higher impact scope 3 emissions is totally fine. That's an accepted form of reporting. Look at the financial significance of the service. Availability of accurate data, which is really important. Again, you may be able to more easily and more readily gather information, for example, on employee commuting than you can on a good that you have shipped in from a different country, and maybe they don't have the information available. Importance to your business and stakeholders is a viable way to actually look at your scope 3 emissions, because again, this is a reputational thing. Again, it's just being transparent about why you've chosen the specific elements that you're looking at. And then the ability to influence the outcome. Basically, all well and good collecting lots and lots of information, but if you can't actually physically do anything with that to reduce the emissions currently, then maybe that's not the first information you should be looking to gather. If you are, like me, within a co-working space or you lease space, your energy and water use are going to be scope 3. So you kind of can collect that information from your landlord. Again, that's kind of a more straightforward one to look at. Water bills and meter readings. So water is a scope 3 goods and service, and again, there's specific information that you can calculate that into a carbon intensity from. Employee commuting and business travel, again, that's pretty easy. Just kind of questionnaire your employees or look at staff expenses to get that information. You're kind of looking at mode of travel, distance travelled, and again, there's pretty readily available conversion factors to work out how much carbon that is. And actually, it's quite a lot. I'm working with a company, and their emissions-based travel is about tenfold their actual office. So, that's kind of something to focus on quite highly. Upstream and downstream logistics, again, depending on what kind of company you have. If you move products, if you store products, that will actually potentially be a large impact. Hotel stays, which is a weird one, but I thought I'd include it. Again, it's a service, and lots of people may be using that quite regularly. It depends if you want to report on that or not. And it could be quite a large part of your Scope 3 emissions. Your product manufacture, depending on what you're producing and again storing, and investments, things like your pensions or bonds or any kind of financial service that you're using. Goods and services. So quite a lot of companies now have EPDs, which are environmental product declarations, where they've actually done a whole life cycle cost of their product, which is brilliant, and then you just get that information from them and you can calculate the carbon emissions, but a lot haven't, because it's an expensive process or they just haven't got around to it yet. So to then calculate the goods and services emissions, you look at kind of the quantity again of the emission, the type of the good, how far it's been transported to you, kind of energy, and basically the Scope 1 and 2 emissions of the company who's producing the product, and various other things like waste generated. So again, waste has a carbon equivalent, whether it was landfilled or incinerated or recycled, and you can again convert that into part of your carbon baseline. And again, you can calculate that based on spend or quantity and apply the available conversion factors. So then you kind of have your baseline depending on what you've actually looked at. So then what do you do with it? So when you report the whole process, you have to be as clear as possible, as accurate as possible, and as transparent as possible. If you have emissions, which within your first report probably there were quite a lot of emissions, just be clear about it and state your kind of forward plans about how you're going to maybe, like I said, kind of make more accurate calculations or how you're going to cover that data. Say how you've managed to get the data, whether it's been through utility bills or whether it's assumptions or whether it's average grid information. And basically, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol has a template. Also, the PPN06 has a template that you can use if you need to put together the reporting. You're obviously encouraged to make it very visible and very obvious what you're doing. So you put it on your own website along with a carbon reduction plan and a commitment for what you're going to do with your emissions, whether you're going to halve it by 2030 or by 2040, or whether you're trying to go net zero before 2050. Obviously quite a lot of people are doing that depending on how you feel you will manage that reduction. But you can also use public disclosure platforms. There are a few, CPD, which I think just means Carbon Disclosure Project. They're just called CPD now, it's CDP now, it's a bit weird. Or GRI, which is the Global Reporting Initiative. And yeah, your targets can be abstract, or you can use the 1.5 science-based targets, which is a specific service. Science-based targets is a company, and you pay them to work out how much your reduction needs to be kind of each year to actually meet your targets. So that's quite a good one, and a lot of people use that. And then within the commitments, obviously you're making that online, but you can also use things like the SME Climate Hub commitment, which is a really great one actually. They have loads and loads of tools. So if you sign up to that, they will, maybe it's too many. It's too much information. I've read a lot of it. It's kind of, but there is as much information as you could possibly want on net zero from that company. But again, they kind of promote the fact that you're doing it, and you can promote as well the fact that you're doing it. You've signed up to your commitment, so you can choose that one, or the World Green Building Council Net Zero commitment, which is also a really good one, just to kind of shout about what you're doing, kind of draw a mark in the sand from which you kind of can't go back. So that's the whole point, basically forcing yourself into this. And then once you've done that, obviously you need to kind of have an action plan for reducing your emissions. So as we've discussed kind of through that process, you've probably boiled down your most significant contributions to emissions. So what do you do with that? Basically, within the office, I kind of define these by different different things that you might want to look at. Within the office, obviously the first one, the easiest one, is probably switch to a renewables tariff, if you haven't done that already. And then maybe have an energy efficiency audit of your office. Again, depending on whether you have the ability to actually change the office if you own it or if that's within your lease, and kind of implement any energy efficiency measures that are identified. Installing renewables or EV charging, it's obviously quite a good one. Even if you don't have EV electric cars, you can obviously sell that back to the grid, and you can kind of use that to offset in a good way your carbon emissions. Thinking about more sustainable commuting, how you might promote that within your staff, kind of making the cycling facilities easier, or maybe kind of providing some sort of subsidy for public transport, that kind of thing. Looking at sustainable procurement within the company, so things like stationery, toiletries, anything that you kind of use in the office. Where's it from? Do they have any kind of carbon commitments? All those sorts of things you can look at. Website optimization, which is quite an interesting one. It's harder to define the carbon emission reduction of optimizing your website, but it is a big, it does have a big impact. So if you think about kind of websites that have lots of moving images or videos or lots of data maybe hidden away in blogs from 2010 that no one looks at, do they need to be there? It's, you know, it's data that's stored, it's data that's using energy to be stored in the cloud. And it's something that I've kind of been looking at more recently. I know someone who does this as a job, and it's actually really interesting, the kind of impact of that sort of thing. And sending information over email, it's a massive thing. So that's quite an interesting thing I just wanted to bring up. Obviously, improving your telecommunications from the office. I think we're all pretty good at that now, but as we all go back to the office, rather than then having to go to meetings because you don't have the setup within the office environment, improving that. Reducing waste, and obviously I've put installing renewables twice. Cool, install renewables. Engaging your staff is obviously really important. Not just on the process and training them on more energy efficiency behaviour, but actually they probably have insights into different areas of the office that have drafts, or that are too hot or too cold or too light or have glare, and all those sorts of things obviously will impact the energy efficiency and energy use of your building. So those sorts of surveys and getting people on board is obviously really important and helpful. Developing an internal sustainability framework for whatever you do, kind of setting targets for where sustainability comes into the decision-making process of whatever you do in terms of procurement or talking to clients or just how you run the office, that kind of thing. Obviously, internal and external communication. This is great if you set everything up like this, but obviously you need to start talking to your clients about it. If it is going to affect maybe who you work with and how you work with them, bringing other people on board is obviously part of the overall goal, so that we're all kind of doing this carbon emission reduction thing. Working from home, carbon footprinting. Obviously, so hybrid working is a massive thing now. So actually getting your employees to think about their use of kind of carbon at home, and how you might, again, through either training or through providing more efficient equipment, might help to actually reduce that. And I think I've talked about training already, so yeah. Industry specific, so depending on what you do. So if you are a landlord or you have an existing portfolio of buildings, maybe you should start kind of assessing them and reducing energy performance across them. And again, that's probably going to be quite a big one if you are kind of a landlord or a lease, you know, that sort of thing. That's going to be quite a large scope 3 emission for you, so that's quite important. Installing metering for better data information, either within within your portfolio or depending on, again, if you're a building services engineer, kind of that sort of thing, is important. Setting targets in your project, so this is more perhaps for architects or structural engineers or other engineers, basically thinking about the embodied carbon of the final result. Procurement, so again, what kind of materials are you using, where are they from, recycled content, that kind of thing, and the energy intensity of the finished product. So are you talking to your clients about that? Are you setting project targets within your company, and are you translating that to your clients so that kind of project by project you're reducing the carbon emissions of the project? Looking at your products and maybe doing that life cycle assessment of your product, so you have the EPD, so that if you are a product manufacturer and people are starting to more look towards product manufacturers who have their environmental performance declaration, you are still there with that certification, with that information to give to your clients. Post-occupancy evaluation of recent projects, so anything over the past 5 years, perhaps go back, survey it, is it working as expected, are there any issues, lessons learned, those sorts of things to feed into future projects. And then, as I've said, offsetting the remainder if you must, but that's probably much further down the line when you're actually trying to get to net zero. There are obviously amazing offsetting. I sound like I'm really anti-offsetting. Well, maybe I am. You know, there are some great things that you can do in terms of offsetting, kind of tree planting or projects in the developing world. But yeah, I think I'm just trying to hammer home, look at it as a very, very final. I can't do anything with the rest of these emissions, so offsetting is fine then. Embedding everything in your company policies and making sure that you set out your targets. I think kind of, again, this is all about kind of really making a firm commitment to doing what you say you're going to do. Talking to your supply chain, I think I've probably already covered this. But yeah, you're doing the training, you're going through it. Can you help support them starting their journey? Can you talk more openly or more advocatively about carbon reduction and that sort of thing? And then, yeah, it's an annual thing. So every year, kind of go back through everything, make it better, make it more streamlined, get more information covered and talk about it every single year because it's brilliant. So where do you actually start? It's a bit mind-boggling. Basically think about your operations, define your operational and organisational boundaries and put together your greenhouse gas inventory. So think about, look at your accounts for the last year, where have you spent lots of money, and start thinking about those as your kind of major emissions that you should be looking at. Obviously collect the easy information, so your bills, electricity, gas, water. Think about surveying your staff for the recent employee commuting and business travel. That's probably going to be quite easy for the last couple of years. None. And basically be really accurate in the data that you're collecting and the methods that you're using for reporting. Sign up to a climate commitment. So like I said, give yourself a kind of kick up the backside to actually do something about it. And then, yeah, think about it as this is just your baseline. You don't need to be perfect, but you just need to start. And then every year you'll hopefully be more au fait with it. It'll be less mind-boggling. And yeah, that's how you start your journey, really. So thank you. That is my time. I don't know if I rushed through that or didn't. So good. There you go.